Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The Vayoran neutral station existed in the precise gravitational midpoint between Earth and the Vayoran home system, which sounded poetic until you actually lived aboard it and realized that gravitational midpoint was an architect's way of saying that nothing quite sat right on any surface, and every liquid in every glass leaned approximately 3 degrees in a direction that had no agreed-upon name. The station's designers, a joint committee that had met 47 times over 6 years, and produced a structure that managed to feel foreign to every species simultaneously, had solved this problem by making all the tables slightly concave, which addressed the liquid issue and created an entirely new problem involving small food items and the concept of personal space. Marcus Hale had worked aboard the station for 11 months, and he had stopped noticing the tables. This was, he felt, either a sign of professional adaptation or personal defeat, and on most days he lacked the energy to determine which. Tonight was a reception night, which meant Marcus had spent the better part of 3 hours doing the work that never appeared in any diplomatic briefing, but constituted roughly 70% of actual diplomacy. He had confirmed the atmospheric processors were calibrated to a blend that neither delegation would find actively unpleasant. He had cross-referenced the Vayoran dietary compatibility charts against the catering manifest, with the specific focus of a man who understood that an allergic incident during a peace reception was, historically speaking, worse for negotiations than most declared wars, and he had personally tested every translation earpiece in the room by speaking into them in English and listening to what came back. Because the last firmware update had introduced a quirk where the word boundary was being rendered in Vayoran as a term that referred specifically to the edge of a burial site, and nobody had caught it until the third session, when Council Darrow Vell had spent 40 minutes believing that humanity's proposed trade boundary was some kind of elaborate funerary metaphor. The morning session had been a quiet catastrophe. The word sovereign had entered the room at 9:42 and had not left peacefully. By 11, the lead Vayoran interpreter had requested a recess in the tone of a person requesting emergency medical attention, and the afternoon had recovered only to the extent that both delegations had agreed, with the fragile professionalism of people who were furious at each other but more furious at the idea of failure, to continue tomorrow. The evening reception was Marcus's attempt to insert something human, or at least humane, into the gap between today's damage and tomorrow's repair. He believed in receptions the way some people believed in medicine and others believed in luck. Not blindly, but with evidence. He had seen a trade agreement survive a morning of genuine hostility because 2 delegates had discovered a mutual appreciation for a particular type of Vayoran string instrument during an evening gathering. He had seen a border negotiation reset entirely after a catering error resulted in both delegations receiving the wrong dishes and spending 40 minutes laughing about it together. Small moments, correctly placed, had a structural importance that no formal session could manufacture. This was Marcus's professional philosophy, and he held it with the quiet conviction of a man who had built a career on things that other people considered too small to matter. The Vayoran delegates arrived in the manner their culture preferred for formal social occasions, which was collectively, and with the synchronized ease of people who had been practicing group movement since childhood. They moved through the reception room with the particular group consciousness that Marcus had spent months learning to read. The slight shifts in positioning that indicated hierarchy, the direction of attention that communicated what the verbal channel was not yet saying. He greeted them in turn, offered the Vayoran gesture of open palms that indicated a room without agenda, and directed the catering staff with the subtle hand signals of a man conducting an orchestra that was entirely composed of canapés. Council Vell arrived mid-group, acknowledged Marcus with the nod of a man who respected competence while remaining uncommitted on the question of warmth, and moved toward the far end of the room where the senior human delegates were already assembled, with the careful positioning of people who had been briefed on Vayoran spatial preferences. Marcus watched the two groups begin their cautious social approach and felt, briefly, optimistic. Then the door opened again. She arrived alone, which was unusual, and late, which was not. Junior attachés carried the longest days because they carried everyone else's work as well as their own. Marcus noticed her immediately. It was difficult not to. Her skin held a faint iridescence that shifted as she moved, something between copper and deep violet that had nothing to do with the lighting and everything to do with her, and her eyes were wide and dark, with a thin ring of silver at the iris that caught the room's glow like the edge of something reflective and patient. Her hair fell in dark waves that moved with a slight, unhurried delay behind her head, as if operating under a private understanding with gravity that differed from the station's general policy on the matter. She was heading for the refreshment table with the focused momentum of a woman who had made a decision and intended to honor it. Marcus reached the table at the same moment she did, and he picked up the water pitcher, room temperature, verified compatible, cleared on 3 separate dietary charts, and poured a glass and held it out to her, because she was tired, and water was water, and this was the simplest hospitable thing a person could do. She took the glass. She said something that his earpiece translated as gratitude. He turned to greet an approaching delegate from the human side, already moving on, already thinking about the next small thing. Then she sipped, and every voice in the room stopped as though someone had reached into the air and removed sound from it entirely. Marcus had a particular reflex, developed over 11 years of diplomatic work, that activated whenever something went wrong in a room full of important people. It was not panic. Panic was a luxury that required spare time, but a rapid, almost mechanical triage process in which he scanned for the source of the problem, assessed the severity on a scale that ran from manageable with an apology to will require a subcommittee, and began moving toward it before the conscious part of his brain had fully caught up with the instinctual part. The reflex had served him well. It had gotten him across a room before a senior delegate collapsed from a malfunctioning atmospheric regulator. It had placed him between 2 junior officials, and a translation error that had briefly suggested one government was calling the other's cultural artifacts decorative garbage. It was, he felt, one of his more reliable professional qualities. It took him 4 full seconds to turn around. This was not the reflex's failure. This was the reflex encountering the specific quality of this silence and requiring additional processing time, because the silence was not the silence of a medical event or a security breach or a diplomatic eruption. It was not any category of silence Marcus had previously filed. It was the silence of a room in which every person present understood something that one person did not, and the weight of that asymmetry was pressing down on the air with the patience of something that had been true for a very long time and was not in any hurry. Sierra Vale was standing exactly where he had left her, which was to say beside the refreshment table with a glass of water held at the precise height at which she had stopped drinking, as if the glass had become an artifact of uncertain classification, and she was waiting for someone to tell her how to proceed. Every member of the Vayoran delegation was looking at her. Counsel Vell, who had in Marcus's experience maintained the effective presentation of a man who had removed the concept of surprise from his operating system sometime in early middle age, looked like a person who had just received information that temporarily exceeded his processing capacity. The other Vayoran officials had arranged themselves into the particular stillness of people communicating through channels that did not require sound. The rapid micro-adjustments of gaze and posture that Marcus had spent months learning to read, and was currently reading as something in the range of collective, coordinated alarm. The human delegates were also silent, but with the different quality of people who did not know what was happening, and were therefore defaulting to the diplomatic instinct of not visibly reacting until they did. Marcus's colleague Britta Saarinen, a senior protocol officer who had once managed a 6-hour session during a solar flare that knocked out half the station's translation infrastructure, was watching the room with the expression of someone filing information very quickly. Marcus completed his turn and looked at Sierra Vale and asked, in the careful, neutral, slightly slower than normal voice he used when he needed his earpiece to render his words with maximum clarity, whether everything was all right. The silver ring around her irises was bright in a way he had not seen before. She looked at him for a moment in which he had the specific experience of being assessed very thoroughly and very quickly, and then she said, in a voice that was low enough to be private and clear enough to carry, that she needed to explain something to him. She said it in the tone of a doctor beginning a conversation that the patient will not enjoy, and Marcus, whose reflex had by now completed its assessment and arrived at a classification somewhere between will require a subcommittee, and has possibly never happened before, said that he was listening. What she said next arrived in pieces, because his earpiece was doing its best, and its best was not quite equal to the task. Vayoran civil law was not a corpus that the translation software had been extensively trained on, and the cultural context module was visibly struggling, occasionally inserting small parenthetical notes into the translation stream that read things like approximate rendering, and once, with what Marcus felt was an almost editorial quality, no established human equivalent. But the general architecture of what she was telling him assembled itself with increasing clarity, and it assembled itself in a direction that his mind kept trying to redirect toward a less significant destination and kept failing to reach. The offering of water, the acceptance of water, the act of drinking it from the offered vessel in the presence of the giver. These three actions in sequence constituted in Vayoran culture the completion of something called the very. His earpiece rendered the word and then added, in parentheses, water bond, and then, after a brief pause that felt almost reluctant, marriage ceremony. Binding portion, the moment of legal completion, 6,000 years of continuous tradition. Witnessed, she said, and she did not need to gesture at the room because the room was already there, full of Vayoran government officials who had all seen it, every one of them a legal witness under civil covenant law, and therefore every one of them a participant in the most permanent social contract that Vayoran civilization had produced in the entirety of its recorded history. More permanent than death, she said, because the very existed between souls. Marcus heard this. He processed it with the part of his brain that was still functioning professionally. He looked at the room. He looked at Counsel Vell, whose expression had evolved from processing overload into something more complex and less readable, and possibly, underneath all of it, carrying the early structural signs of a very long headache. He looked at his colleague Britta, who had caught enough of the conversation to have gone very still in the way that people go still when they are deciding whether to intervene, and have concluded that there is no intervention available. Then Marcus looked back at Sierra Vale, who was still holding the glass with the careful stillness of someone managing several things simultaneously, and he said, after a pause in which he reviewed 9 possible responses and discarded all of them, the only thing his mind had available that was both true and not catastrophically inadvisable. He asked if there was a form for this. From somewhere in the Vayoran delegation, there was a sound. It was brief and quickly suppressed, but it was identifiably the sound of someone encountering something unexpected enough to briefly override their professional composure. Counsel Vell looked at Marcus with an expression that had acquired a new layer, unclassifiable and faintly, dangerously close to something that was not entirely disapproval. And Sierra Vale, who had been managing several things simultaneously with admirable steadiness, looked at him for one long moment before the corner of her mouth moved in a direction that was, unless Marcus's social reading was entirely wrong, the beginning of something that was not yet a smile, but was clearly its immediate predecessor. It was the first moment of the evening that felt, in spite of everything, like the room had exhaled. The station's legal affairs office was, by the objective measurement of square meters, the smallest room on the Vayoran neutral station that was still technically classified as an office rather than a storage unit. This classification had been disputed twice in the station's operational history, both times by the legal affairs officers who worked in it, and both times unsuccessfully, because the committee responsible for spatial allocations operated on a definition of office that required only a desk, a chair, and the theoretical possibility of a second chair if the first chair was moved slightly to the left. There were currently 4 people in the room, which meant that the concept of personal space had been suspended by mutual, unspoken agreement, and the atmospheric processors were working with quiet urgency to keep up. Priya Mehta had been the station's legal affairs officer for 3 years, and she had handled things. She had handled a contested salvage claim involving wreckage that both governments argued was historically significant, and neither government wanted to pay to preserve. She had handled the sacred artifact situation, which had required 14 separate legal frameworks applied in sequence like layers of a geological formation. She had handled, on one memorable Tuesday, a simultaneous jurisdictional dispute and a catering contract violation, and she had handled them both before lunch. She was, by any reasonable professional standard, unshakable. She was currently shaking slightly, in the specific way of someone who is holding themselves together through the application of focused professional will, and the effort was visible only in the precise, over-careful way she was arranging documents on her desk that did not need arranging. Marcus noticed this and found it, in the way that shared incredulity can function as a kind of companionship, genuinely comforting. Dr. Kenji Okafor had arrived 12 minutes after being summoned, which was fast enough to suggest he had not been deeply asleep, and slow enough to suggest he had taken the time to assess the message twice before believing it. He was a compact, methodical man who carried a physical notepad in addition to his legal tablet, because he had explained to Marcus once that when he encountered something he did not fully understand, writing it by hand forced him to process it more carefully. He had filled 2 pages already, and they had not yet formally begun. Attaché Lorne Vell arrived with the Vayoran Civil Covenant under her arm in the manner of a person who had not retrieved it from a shelf, but had simply always had it with her, waiting. It was a physical document, which was notable. Vayoran legal records were almost entirely maintained in distributed quantum archive, but the Civil Covenant existed in material form because, as Attaché Lorne explained without being asked, some documents needed to be things you could hold, because their weight was part of their meaning. She set it on Priya's desk with a precision that suggested she knew exactly how much it weighed, and intended for everyone present to feel it. The relevant passage was located with the efficiency of someone who knew where it was before she opened the cover. It was read aloud in Vayoran, then translated, then read aloud again in the flattened, over-enunciated cadence that people use when they want to ensure that nobody in the room can later claim they misheard. The earpieces rendered it faithfully except for one phrase in the 3rd sentence, which the cultural context module rendered as a bond recognized by the architecture of existence, and then added in its parenthetical way, possibly metaphorical, confidence level 63%. Dr. Okafor wrote something on his notepad. Then he asked about the intention clause. He asked it with the specific quality of a man who had identified what he believed might be a legally viable foothold and was testing its load-bearing capacity before committing his weight to it. Attaché Lorne looked at him. She had the face of someone who had anticipated this question, had prepared for this question, and had prepared for it specifically because it was the question that everyone asked when they encountered the Vary's legal structure for the first time and began looking for the exit. She explained, with a patience that was entirely professional and only faintly resembled the patience of a person explaining something to someone who should already know it, that Vayoran law defined intention by action rather than internal mental state. The action of offering water was an act of hospitality. The action of accepting and drinking it was an act of hospitality received. The intentions were present in the gestures themselves, fully and legally, regardless of what the participants understood those gestures to mean. Dr. Acaffer asked whether ignorance of the tradition constituted a mitigating factor. Attaché Lorne said that in 6,000 years of Vayoran jurisprudence, this question had not previously arisen, because in 6,000 years of Vayoran civilization, every Vayoran had known exactly what the very meant, and the possibility of a species that did not had not been a scenario that the ancient legal scholars had considered worth addressing, possibly because their imagination, though considerable, had its limits. She said this without judgment, though the absence of judgment was itself somehow very present. Dr. Acaffer wrote 3 more things on his notepad and underlined one of them. Priya asked, with the carefully constructed neutrality of a legal officer trying not to editorialize, what the practical diplomatic consequences would be if the very were simply not recognized on the human side. Attaché Lorne opened the civil covenant to a second section. The section was longer than the first. Priya listened to the translation, and her document arranging resumed. The atmospheric processors hummed with renewed commitment. Marcus sat with the particular stillness of a man who understood that he was the subject of a legal discussion, in the way that a disputed territory is the subject of a treaty, present, significant, and not currently being consulted. He was constructing, in parallel, the first draft of his incident report, and the incident report was acquiring subclauses at a rate that suggested it would eventually require its own table of contents. Subclause 3 was going to be difficult. Subclause 7, which dealt with outcomes, currently existed only as a heading followed by a blank space that he was not yet ready to fill. Sira Vale was in the corner with a cup of tea, which Priya had provided from the small station unit beside her desk, and which was. Marcus had noted with the reflexive cultural vigilance that 11 months aboard the station had made automatic, a completely neutral beverage with no ceremonial significance in any known tradition, a fact he had confirmed internally with slightly more urgency than the situation probably required. She had said very little since the legal discussion began. She had listened with the focused, patient attention of someone who was waiting for the conversation to arrive at the point where the people in the room accepted that some problems could not be solved by the people adjacent to them, and only then she said that she would like to speak to Marcus alone. The room assessed this. Counsel Vell, who had arrived midway through Attaché Lorne's second reading and had been standing near the door with the expression of a man deciding whether the room was large enough to contain everything that was happening in it, looked at Marcus. Dr. Acaffer looked at his notepad. Priya looked at the middle distance with the expression of a legal affairs officer calculating documentation risk against diplomatic necessity, and arriving at a conclusion she would not be writing down. Marcus said yes before anyone else could say anything, because some situations, he had learned, resolved faster when the person at the center of them made the first move, and because Sira Vale was watching him with the quiet, silver-edged patience of someone who already knew what kind of person he was and was waiting to see if he did. The corridor on the station's outer ring was not a place people came deliberately. It existed in the architectural gap between 2 functional sections, a narrow passage with a row of observation windows along one wall that looked out at a density of stars that had no atmosphere between itself and you, and the effect was less romantic than it was honest. The universe was very large and very old, and the station was a small, warm thing floating in the middle of it, and the windows made sure you knew this. Marcus had found the corridor in his second week aboard and had returned to it periodically ever since, in the way that people return to places that tell them true things. He had brought 2 glasses of water without deciding to. His hands had found the refreshment table in the reception room, still largely undisturbed despite the evening's events, and had poured them before the conscious part of his brain had issued any instruction. And he had carried them into the corridor and set them on the narrow sill below the windows, and then stood looking at them for a moment with the expression of a man reviewing his own behavior and finding it both completely understandable and not entirely advisable. Sierra Vale looked at the glasses. She looked at him. Then she laughed, and it was not the managed, professional sound that people produce when something is mildly amusing in a context where full laughter would be inappropriate. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the kind that arrives before social architecture can intercept it, and it filled the corridor with something that the corridor had probably not contained very often. The silver at the edges of her irises caught the starlight through the windows and brightened with it. And for the first time since she had picked up a glass of water and rearranged the legal and diplomatic landscape of two civilizations simultaneously, she looked entirely like herself rather than like a person, managing the consequences of being herself. Marcus left both glasses on the sill. He sat on the narrow bench opposite the windows and told her that he had not done it on purpose, and she said that she knew, and he said that he wanted to be clear about that, and she said that his clarity on the subject was, at this point, thoroughly established, and there was a pause in which they both understood that the facts of the situation had been fully acknowledged between them and could now be set down somewhere and left there while they had a different conversation. He asked her to tell him about the very, not the legal architecture of it, not the diplomatic weight of it, but the thing itself, where it came from, what it meant to the people who had carried it for 6,000 years. He asked because he was a man who had spent his career believing that the distance between two civilizations was almost always a distance between two stories that had not yet been told to each other, and because he thought, with the particular instinct that had made him good at his work, that this was the conversation the evening had actually been trying to reach. She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone deciding how much of a true thing to give to a question. Then she told him about the founding drought, which was what Vayoran history called the period 4,000 years before the Vayoran calendar began, 2,000 years before the Veri was codified. In an era before codification existed, when the Vayoran home world had gone without significant rainfall for 60 years, and what water remained had become the central fact of every relationship, every alliance, every act of trust or betrayal that their civilization had produced. To give your water to another person was not a gesture in that time. It was a statement of the most serious kind. I have assessed the risk, and I choose your continuation over my caution. And to receive it and drink was to say, I accept the weight of that choice, and I give you my life in return for it, because now my life is made of your trust. The witnesses were there because trust in that era was a public matter. The things that held a civilization together needed to be seen. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was a skill he had developed deliberately and valued more than most of his others. When she finished, he told her about water on Earth. He did not make a speech of it. He was not a speech-making kind of diplomat. But he told her about oceans that his ancestors had crossed without knowing what was on the other side, and about the fact that the first thing any human culture offered to a guest, across every civilization he had ever studied, was water, and that the reason was the same reason it had always been, which was that water was the one thing every living thing needed, and therefore the one thing whose offering could not be misread. He said that when he had poured that glass, he had meant exactly what his culture had always meant by it. I see that you need something, and I have it, and here it is. He had not known he was also saying something else. But he was not, he said, entirely sure the something else was wrong. Sierra looked at him for a long moment. The stars outside the window were doing nothing in particular, which was what stars mostly did, and they did it with great conviction. She told him that she did not want the very undone, which was in any case not a thing that Vayoran law provided a mechanism for, and which she would not have wanted even if it had, because You did not undo the most serious thing your civilization knew how to do simply because it had arrived in an unexpected shape. But she also did not want him to be standing in something he had not chosen, and she wanted him to know the difference between those two things, because she understood them as entirely compatible, and she suspected that he did too. Marcus considered this with the full weight of his attention. He thought about subclause 7 of his incident report, which was still blank, and about the treaty negotiations that would resume in the morning and would be, by any objective measure, profoundly strange. He thought about the 11 months he had spent on this station, learning to read a civilization from the outside, and how much of it he had understood correctly, and how much he was still getting wrong. He thought about the fact that the most significant thing that had happened to him in his diplomatic career had been caused by a pitcher of water and a reflexive act of hospitality, and that this seemed, the more he sat with it, less like a catastrophe and more like the kind of accident that only looks like an accident from one direction. He told her that he had never handled anything simple in 10 years, and he was not going to start now, but that he was, if she was willing, interested in figuring out what they were. She said that was, in her assessment, a reasonable diplomatic position. He said he was going to need to file a very long report. She said that she had already begun drafting the Vayoran equivalent, and that it currently had 11 sections, and that Section 9 was giving her difficulty. He asked what Section 9 covered. She said it was the section where she was required to describe her own state of mind at the time of the incident, and that the form provided 4 options, none of which were accurate, and that she was considering requesting a 5th option be added to the form, which would read something in the approximate range of uncertain but not unwilling, which was not a legal category that currently existed in Vayoran civil documentation, but which she felt covered the situation more honestly than anything the existing options provided. Marcus looked at the 2 glasses of water on the windowsill, sitting where he had left them, equal and untouched, with the stars arranged behind them in the patient, uncommitted way of witnesses who have no opinion on the outcome. Then he picked up both glasses, handed one to Sira Vale, and held his own and waited, because some moments needed to be chosen rather than fallen into, and because he was, when it came to it, a man who believed in the weight of small gestures and the civilizations that had learned to mean them. She took the glass. She looked at him. She did not drink, and neither did he, and both of them understood that this was a different thing entirely from the first time. Not an accident, not an oversight, not a cultural briefing document nobody had written. Just 2 people holding water in a corridor full of stars, deciding together what it meant.